The concept of racial capitalism captures how capitalism and racial hierarchies are historically connected with each other. So capitalism emerged on the basis of colonialism, and these racial hierarchies, which were installed in a more rigid way during colonialism, they remain deeply imbricated. So capitalism remains deeply imbricated with these racial hierarchies. And I think the concept is relevant for global labor studies, since many forms of segmentation of labor, so which is the split between different workforces and also between different groups in one company, for example. So these processes of separation of workers are connected with racism too. So for example, workers in better paid white-collar jobs often exclude other workers based on racism. And in this way, racism is one of the means how social control is exercised. Historically, this separation into groups was based on the contrast between slavery and free labor. And today, the separation into different forms of labor is being reproduced in manifold forms, both between countries and within countries. And we also have to highlight that apart from European racism that got globalized with colonialism, there also exist other forms of racism, like the caste system, which grew in parallel with European imperialism and then was later on integrated into global capitalism. Yeah, I think it's important to see that racism is crucial for various areas, for economic organization, for political domination, and also for ideological models like culture and ways of life. I will give like 3 examples. Like on the one hand, racism serves as an ordering element to distinguish better and less good positions in employment, the less secure, more demanding and lower paid jobs being more accessible to racialized parts of the population. Second, racism is also an important element to create alliances between parts of the working classes and elites. So in this way, social control is a central aspect of racism. And here the control refers much also to the racially privileged parts of the population as a key aspect. So it's not just the oppressed groups which are being controlled. It's also, to a large extent, racially privileged groups. And the third example I want to give is, like, for example, the identification of productiveness and whiteness is very important. So with this identification, certain forms of social reproduction are racialized, forms of social reproduction that do not serve the capitalist market. For example, self-sufficiency and being close to nature are often marked as primitive or backward. So the concept of the Plantationocene refers to how large plantations established a certain pattern of economic organization. And this idea is that this pattern of organization combines degradation of ecological environments with racism and also large-scale productive organization. So these large plantations emerged with colonialism in the Americas, but also in Africa and Asia. The Portuguese had used similar models, for example, in colonization on the island of Madeira, which is in front of the African continent. But then these earlier forms of plantations took on a different character, more rigid and also much more large scale when applied, for example, in the northeast of Brazil and the Caribbean from the 16th century on, and 17th century, and later in Asia and Africa with production of sugarcane, and later with other products such as cotton. So what we understand as modern time management in factories, for example, measuring every step of a labor process, had already been established on plantations. And many characteristics of industrial factories can also already be found on plantations. So this of plantations being a bit of a prototype of factories is not a completely new finding, but the concept of the plantation scene revives the debate about the relevance of plantations and highlights how racial hierarchies and ecological degradation were constituent elements of that model of plantations.